Muy buenas tardes, muy buenos días y muy buenas noches, porque estamos en el espacio virtual.
Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, because we're in a virtual space, so we cover all time zones. Thank you for being here in this space organized by INSTAR. We are devoting a day to the Cuban hip hop community, and we have two representatives of that community. Soandry del Río is a rapper, and he has also organized important events for Cuba's hip hop community. Also, Jose Luis. Jose Luis has been an art director and stage director in an event called Puños Arriba, which was also extremely important for Cuba's hip hop community, and he has been involved with MatraKa and Rotilla. So we are all here among friends. Thank you for being here. So I will start with you, Soandri. You are one of the oldest rap performances that I know of, and when I started to produce Rotilla, when we had assembled MatraKa, you were a reference in the hip hop world. You were a master of sorts. So I would like to ask you to tell us about your beginnings and your community. Also, what were your musical references in your early stages? Well, what can I tell you? These are times that will never return. Those early days are part of a story that I don't regret having experienced. It led me to understand art, as we do, those of us who come from the old school. I think that it was a form of art that allowed us all to grow. We only had international references because at the time hip hop was in bloom internationally. But we had access to very few sources and we had to find our own voice. Of course, in Cuba, for the most part, people are interested in tropical dance music, and the cultural policy controlled all aspects of Cuban art and culture. If you wanted to record music, you needed permission from the institutions, the government institutions, and you needed to go through their channels. That gradually changed, and nowadays people have access to a computer and a phone. But the millennial generation, they really don't know what it is like to try to make your way in music without having access to social media or a computer at home or any of those, let's say, logistics that nowadays are available to ordinary citizens. So each of us was working on their own. We had very few sources. Our only reference was our neighborhood, the streets, our everyday experiences, and maybe something that you would overhear in a bus. And this is why the music we produced at the time developed as they did. Of course, back then there was a stronger censorship in the field of Cuban culture, specifically thinking about lyrics and spaces where you could perform. In order to perform, you would have to be approved. Nowadays, they might tell you you can't sing in public, but you can make a record at home and you can post it on social media. People will be able to hear it, but back then, that wasn't the case. So these were wonderful experiences that led me to grow as a human being and informed my understanding of the world. I think all of the people who experienced those days, we understand things differently, even history. Maybe currently, younger people are a bit chronocentric, and I don't know, they don't search for their historical background, but we embody that background and we have a different understanding. So those were my early days. Hip hop for me was a therapy, was a form of self-discovery, and it was a way to speak on my own behalf. Many artists nowadays are only concerned with success. That we weren't thinking about success at all. And nowadays, many people from the old school are trying to upload their material to social networks because they produced things without thinking about success. You would just simply broadcasting what was in your head to the world because you felt the urge, the need to do it, and what others thought about it was no concern. I want to ask you two questions. You mentioned the neighborhood. You said the neighborhood influenced you. Yesterday, we talked about performance art and poetry with the people from Omnisona Franca, and they mentioned that something that was very important to their process of self discovery was the Alamar neighborhood. This is a neighborhood which has endured a sustained relationship with rap music. Many movements come from there and many performers. So when you talk about the neighborhood, are you also talking about Alamar or do you mean the neighborhood in a broad sense? Well, I grew up in two different areas and different. One is Cohiman, which back then, a few years back, it was to some extent a residential neighborhood. It's changed a lot. It was a historical neighborhood. Many important historical events had taken place there, but that's been gradually erased as everything here. But many artists lived there. That changed. But my other important reference was always Alamar. Since when I was 13 years old, I went to live there with my grandparents and I went to elementary and secondary school there. And I think that now Alamar is a living museum of stagnant socialism. Back then, at the time when Cuban rap started to flourish and became notorious during what is known as a special period in Cuba, I was a young Cuban person and I had many questions that needed to be answered. And I believe that I got the answers from Cuban hip hop. And and then I was able to amplify the discourse of others and find that platform. for my voice. I later understood that the threat that is implicit in uh, the power of a black young man on a stage to summon people when you can have 3,000 people listening to you, as happened at the amphitheater in Alamar. I want to talk more about Alamar. Would you agree in saying that Alamar was an influential area for rap in Cuba? Alamar is the source. It there you had all of the conditions for the genre to flourish because Alamar is a community project. You know what I mean? So what happened there is that many people who had housing problems, the government brought them there. And it's also at the periphery of Havana. So it's a kind of a ghetto combined. There were military people because they were also housed there, and the buildings were built by the prisoners. And then maybe somebody's house in Havana would fall down and they would be sent to Alamar. So a very diverse crowd of people came together there. All of them were people from the middle lower classes, and there was even a racial mixture in Alamar. Let's say that you had interracial marriages, so to speak, and this was perceived very differently in Alamar from other locations in Cuba. It was a kind of like a mixed chunky soup. And also the coast was nearby. There were 5-floor buildings. You had the channels. You could get radio stations from Florida, and people would build antennas to be able to get the signal. So the conditions were there. And Alamar also resembled, at least we rappers to our minds, it resembled Queens in New York. You know, we were aware of New York hip hop, and we had a feeling for the urban landscape of Queens, and we fantasized with that kind of thing, and we created connections between the two coasts. So Alamar is it's my life. I always say that I will never move. I wish I could have a house elsewhere in Cuba, but I will never move from here because it's part of my DNA. I need to sleep with the air from the northern coasts. It's a code that is inserted in my body. So you could have two houses, one in Marianao and one in Kohima. Yeah, or Vedado, Siboney, I don't know. Maybe Guantanamo. But Alamar will always be there. So you always draw a distinction. You talk about very different times. I think you're speaking from the point of view of creators. You were talking about the old school, and this leads me to assume that there is also a new school in rap music. What would be the distinction between the old school and the new school according to you? Well, I'm also part of the new school, if there is such a thing, because I continue to interact with the scene and I continue to build within what we could call the new school and even the concept of the millennial. I'm part of that as well. So when I talk about the old school and I establish a kind of a boundary which is necessary, it's necessary because nowadays nobody cares about previous work, but many people sacrificed a lot. They made a huge effort to open doors. And nowadays, as I said before, this isn't valued and people aren't interested in that anymore. But I cannot forget that because I was there. I was part of everything that happened back then. So, something characteristic of creators from the old school is that, first and foremost, everyone was trying their utmost, the utmost to be authentic. And I think that has been lost. Nowadays, people are imitating formulas for success. But something that I liked about the old school was that everyone was trying to have their own label. Plagiarism was unimaginable. That was unthinkable. And nowadays, I think that many things resemble others and people copy each other. So this is why I always say this. I think that we went from being a jungle, a diverse jungle, and we became a corn plantation. I think that now things are much more uniform. To mention a detail, I mean, I think that artists tried harder and they were a bit more responsible in terms of what they said because they they did research. They did some more research. As always, there were fights and there was immature people. But I think that at a certain moment, the vanguard of Cuban rap was creating in a very responsible way. And I also like about the old school that success was did not depend on approval from elsewhere. People were authentic, they were broadcasting what they had to say, and we didn't care about what the world thought. Of course, you would reach success when you presented yourself to the world authentically. Do you think that nowadays social media are a key factor in the new school? I think that they are because nowadays what matters the most to artists is opinion as manifested in social media. So they create their marketing strategies or their lyrics um, are contingent on prevalent opinions in social media. And there's nothing wrong with that. But as I said, uh, I'm old fashioned. I want to know the artist. I want to know the artist as they are. I don't need a fictional character. I prefer a cold, upsetting truth to a lukewarm fiction. So I prefer artists who renounce comfort. It's no use to me that you have a lot of people listening to what you say if it's not you, if it's construction. This is an objection that I have in some contexts, but of course, now as before, there are some people who are valuable and people who have some work to do. But the mainstream right now is that people are renouncing authenticity, and this is why art is more uniform now. And I don't like that so much. I prefer diversity, each people being their own. And a world of thinking people, not of fanatics who follow. Thanks, Soa. I want to talk to Luis, so I want first to rehearse a brief chronology. We at MatraKa Producciones, we were quite aware of Alamar as a location. We knew that it was a very important place for hip hop. There was a festival there, the Grupo Uno Festival. Rodolfo Rensoli, who was involved, was supposed to be with us today and he couldn't attend, but I wanted to mention him. He was one of the people who created that festival, which did a lot to promote Cuban rap. It was also mentioned yesterday by David and Amauri in our conversation. So at MatraKa, we started out further east. We worked around El Vedado, but we were aware of Alamar and the people who were working there. But we started out with electronic music, maybe around 2005, 2006. We were approached and we became acquainted with a group of rappers, Michael Estremo, Los Aldeanos, I think Soandry, you as well. And they proposed to provide a kind of support because you wanted to create a rap market. You wanted to find a way to commercialize the music, to sell music and other products. So you wanted to create a market, and we thought it was really interested, and we provided our support, and that was known as Comisión Depuradora. Back then, I couldn't have foreseen how important that would be for the rap community. 2 years later, the same group of people conceived Puños Arriba, or Raised Fists, that was intended as a festival that would support independent production in all regards. So people would produce albums or music on their own, send it to us, and we would reward winners with a prize. We gave prize to within different genres in rap, and I dare say that let's say, we favored within the genre was we wanted to support uh, higher quality in production. We were interested in quality on the stage, aesthetic quality, and somebody who played a crucial role in that regard was Luis Cabrera Restoy. He has been a set designer, art director. He has provided spatial concepts when we have questions like this, how to transform an area, a location, how to intervene. He has worked with us for a long time, since maybe 2007, 2008. So I will let you speak now. Maybe if you could explain how you first became acquainted with us, how you first became interested in hip hop and involved. Well, I come from Santa Clara, and it's a city with a lot of culture. Maybe there's more of a tradition in trova and singer-songwriter genre. But at some point, hip hop culture also became very strong in Santa Clara. And at the time, I was a student in art school, and me and all of my friends were captivated by hip hop. So we were very involved in the hip hop scene in Santa Clara. I remember that one time my mom broke a tape recorder that I used to hear music because we lived in a small house and I loved to play music. So at some point, since artists in Havana didn't have places to perform, they started to come to Santa Clara. There they could find places to perform and a welcoming audience. And I met many performers that way, including Michael Extremo. I later went to Havana and he was a friend there, and he invited me to become part of the group that was creating the festival Puños Arriba. When we started to become a bit more mature in terms of musical production, we realized that there was a lot of work to be done to improve the quality of musical products and the possibility of creating an internal market. That was what we wanted to do at the time, and we started to pay close attention to, for example, all elements of the recording business, the record covers. And when we created the competition, we, we asked people to provide making video material, making of material, and so this brought us closer to people from the visual arts because we wanted to talk to visual artists who could assist us in helping people develop those aspects further. I agree that one of our most important goals was to improve the quality of music production. The festival was a platform for many artists from the new school who are now established artists, for example, Barbaro Urbano and many others who were getting started back then and they used the festival as a platform. When I talk about Puños Arriba, I always think of Michael Extrema. We could we have to speak of him because back then he was the driving force. He devoted a lot of energy and time to develop the festival, and then Soandry took over and he did an extremely good job directing the festival. But basically, my experience was focused on creating a visual language in live performance to have a kind of like art direction. Although we worked on it all together constantly, but that was my focus. And I'm extremely happy to have shared those experiences with all of you because we were very close at the
Y
time.
con la producción, ¿cómo fue tu experiencia, Luiso? Yo tengo muchas memorias de haber sido,
And
antes de gestionar yo mismo producción, si no lo hacía
tell us
Didier.
about your
Tengo
experiences
memorias de
in
haberlo hecho yo.
production.
Y
I
evidentemente la
remember
gente de
trying
la
to
producción
organize
muchas veces
productions
busca aterrizar
myself,
al artista soñador, ¿no? Bueno, ya sea
and
por aterrizar
of
en sí
course,
mismo, pues será muy lejos,
often
ya sea por
when
cuestiones
you are going to produce, you
presupuestarias,
need to
materiales, ¿no?
bring
¿Cómo es tu
an artist who's a
experiencia
dreamer
adentro
uh,
produciendo Puños
back
Arriba?
down to
Con
earth
MatraKa, con
because there
nosotros.
are limitations with the budget and other limitations. So tell us about your experiences in that regard. Well, producing the festival, maybe before that, I started to develop projects when I was an art student and we were in the time of crisis. There was a lot of scarcity. So we always tried to find how to get things done with the least possible resources. So we had to resort to alternative means. And what I did was to bring these experiences, and I continue to do it. Right now, I still do that. I try to use those principles of working with as little as possible to production in the festival. Of course, we had a lot of support from you at MatraKa, but more often than not, we didn't have access to the materials that we would have wanted or needed to have a decent production. So instead, we had to make things in a makeshift way by hand, and we developed a way of doing it, and ultimately there was
Y
an aesthetics
una,
for the
una,
festival.
una característica, ¿no? Que yo entiendo muy importante y me lanzo a decirlo así porque, bueno, la vivimos en aquellas
There's something that
producciones y las gestiones
I
que yo
believe
llevé a
is very
cabo. Fue la
important, and I would say
relación
that we all
nuestra como
experienced it
proyecto,
ourselves
como grupo creador,
at the
por supuesto,
time,
de
was
género
our
urbano, la
relationship as a
relación con las
project, as a
instituciones.
group of creators
Tenemos,
in
creo que la
the
capacidad de
rap
analizar eso, porque
genre.
esto lo vivimos
our relationship to institutions. I think we have way too many stories to tell about this. This was a constant in our work, but I wanted to bring a few things up, namely, first of all, censorship, censorship which was experienced by Puños Arriba and also rap music as a genre when the government agency focused on rap was created. And secondly, maybe if we could discuss a protest that we all organized. I think this was one of the first occasions in which an artist collective organized a similar protest in Cuba. There have been others, of course, but this one maybe has been forgotten. At the time, however, it created uh, many waves. We spent a whole day in front of a cultural institution at the building. Important people would walk by because they were going to conduct their own business and they would stop and talk to us. And I remember that it was very relevant. And I think that we achieved our goal. We wanted to let them we wanted them to let us organize our event. They wanted to censor us by restricting us to using a very small venue, and that was our response. So I would like to um, tell us about these experiences. We had to deal with censorship together, and then we organized that protest, which was really important for us. I can't remember exactly when it was. I think 2015. Yeah, it was December 2015. Right, it was also the Human Rights Day. So if you want to share your recollections of that time, well, what can I tell you about that day? Part of what I was talking about just now, when I mentioned chronocentrism, there are people who think that what happened at 27N was the first such event. But, well, I want to talk about the positive. That day I went there, I had a deodorant, a bathrobe, my toothbrush. I was prepared to spend a month out there because you never know what might happen. What they call the sacred space, which is the street, when you have no other resource to demand what you need, what is fair. Because what happened with the festival is that we obtained all the permits and they made us work for about 6 months. And when it was only a day before the festival, after saying first yes, then no, come later, then they told us that we couldn't do the event. I remember what I said to someone, I don't remember the person's name, the secretary or whatever. I told him, "You're gonna awaken a lion if you keep messing with me." That's the last thing I said to him, and I walked out. So, our main goal, we had a commitment. We had a commitment to the people, to the artists. We had a commitment to Cuban culture because so a person to sit in a building and decide what is culture and what isn't, well, regardless of that, culture is what the people does. And we went out there to remind them of that because we had those commitments and we weren't asking anything from the institution. We just wanted a legal permit to to hold the event because moreover everything was ready. It's one of the most my most liberating experiences. And Luiso, I'll hand the mic. It's the same for me. I laughed when you said that you brought your toothbrush to the protest because it was a really exciting moment. because we knew that we were doing something important. First of all, the festival as such, but then when they tried to censor us to some degree, because they had already attempted to censor the Rotilla festival, so we knew what they were trying to do. And I don't think we ourselves at the time understood the power of Cuba's hip hop community. I remember that rappers came to the office where we were organizing the event. They came on the previous day. They were there to pick up their credentials. They assumed the festival would take place the day after. And then spontaneously we told them what was happening, and we all collectively decided to go to the Ministry of Culture and to demand our rights. We knew that the street was a delicate place to stage a protest. I remember uh, I left the money that I had to my girlfriend. I also grabbed my toothbrush and I said goodbye, thinking that I might not see her in a long time. Recently, I actually found a picture, a photograph taken back then. All the rappers are there before the institute. It's a historical photograph, and I really do think that it was something important for us, and it was also important for as a point of reference for people who organize other actions later, because of course we were immature back then in that regard. We didn't know how to organize protests and go out on the streets and do activism, but we did it. Although we knew that it would have been only a provisional victory, but we were able to hold the event and it was great. And we know how it all unfolded later on, of course. They started to close spaces until eventually it was impossible for us to continue organizing the event. But I think that it left a mark. And nowadays, we basically, and I'll say this proudly, we have the best Spanish language rappers in Cuba, and they were all close to Puños Arriba. I think that the three of us here, we can be proud of it. As for the day, I have so many memories. People coming, some artists who came to our side, and others, in fact, were informants for the state security. But all in all, it was an extremely good experience because we were able to be together as a community and demand our rights. And that is really empowering. And we were able
Adelante, yo tengo una
to
memoria
demonstrate
muy
that
clara
on
como,
that day.
digamos, un parteaguas en la crisis con las instituciones. En este caso se da con la Agencia
I
Cubana de
remember that
Radio,
there was
y es
also a
cuando la
very important
agencia
moment in this
comienza a
critical
insertar
relation with
a
institutions.
exponentes de otros
I'm talking
géneros como el
about when
reggaetón
the
y
Cuban Rap
genera dentro de la misma agencia
Agency
una especie de
started
competitividad
to
entre exponentes
introduce
donde un
performers
tiempo
who
después los
work
raperos
in
se
other
convirtieron
genres
en los
like
por los que esa
reggaeton.
agencia fue
And the
fundada,
agency started
empiezan
to
a ser
create a kind of
segregados
competition
y los
between the
jóvenes que
genres.
habían tenido unos
The
circuitos y una
agency had been
comercialización anterior
founded
se
to
sintieron
support
devolverlos
rappers, but then
a
it
medios
started to
oficiales
segregate
únicamente para decir
rappers.
talento, ¿no?
And
Y
since
inició una discusión
reggaeton
sobre esto hace como
performers were
una
more
década
successful, in
y bueno,
particular because
Cuba
of
vivió una de las
tourism,
primeras
they became more
instancias
prominent within
en ese
the
ambiente,
agency
¿no?
and they
Y
gained more
también, si
support.
ahora no me
So I
equivoco,
would
fuiste
like you
expulsado
to
de
tell
Causa
us
Rap.
your experiences. I think, in fact, that you were recently expelled from the agency, Soandri. Yes, I was expelled from the Cuban Rap Agency. I remember that I was very active at the time. I was traveling quite a bit. I was going to Miami. I was recording material independently, and the argument they used to expel me was that I wasn't reporting money that I was earning to the agency. So I told them, look, are you finding events for me to perform on because they're supposed to be an agency that represents artists. And so, but when you went there, you would just find a lot of people sitting in their computers playing computer games. So I told them, look, I'm finding I'm earning money because I'm working on my own behalf. You're not finding spaces for me to perform. And look at everything that I have done this year, and I'm making that money on my own, so I should not report it to you. That year I had recorded a very important album, and I told them, I'm not going to sign this paper where you expel me from the agency unless you write that you are expelling me for ideological reasons, because that was the true reason. But the main reason is when we went to Panama, they were trying to set me up since Puños Arriba. Uh, Please, Soandri, 1 second, let me explain to people and contextualize. Many of us, people from the Cuba's creative community, we have often been invited to participate in the summits of the Americas as representatives of Cuba's civil society. Usually, when they bring artists, they give them space to sing, to talk about, to share their experiences, etc. So Andri, myself, and other Cuban artists, we went to the summit when it was held in Panama. I don't remember the year, around 2015, 2016. But when you come back from such a public presentation to the island, there are consequences. They might be direct, they might be waiting for you at the airport, but they might be delayed. They may start to accuse you in your own context, in your neighborhood, in your place of work, where you study, accuse you. So Soandri was expelled from the Cuban Rap Agency in response to his participation in that event. Right, and part of the success that reggaeton has experienced in recent years is due to the fact that at some point in the country's cultural history, reggaeton was useful to the Cuban state in their cultural policy. So they wanted to empower reggaeton to block the discourse on behalf of freedom of expression that was being generated by Cuban rap. Now it's all about how many people follow you, but to be truthful, we should see what would have happened if what popular dance music, which is reggaeton nowadays, if it had been censored as strongly as Cuban rap was from the very beginning, and that censorship grew gradually worse with time. We should bear that in mind. It's very important. It was a real circus. I'm talking about these meetings of what they call the syndicate or the union. I went to one of those meetings and I told the woman who directed the Cuban Rap Agency, I told her, this is a circus, this is not a union. A union is a place where workers meet, but not the people who manage the company. So she, the director, she couldn't be running a meeting of workers. But well, that meeting was a kind of like a group analysis in an elementary school. They set up a chalkboard and they would say so and so has made so much money, so and so has performed so many times. So then they were comparing people who were making popular dance music, who had access to bars, who could be played in the radio because he was talking about shaking your booty, and then other artists who were telling people, look, there's a problem, we have problems. and we need to contribute to the construction of our own country. So you had two paths pointing in completely opposite directions within the same institutions and group of people. And so in those union meetings, they would compare both kinds of performers, even though when you went to a rap concert, especially in public squares, when you were invited, they were also playing reggaeton. You had to talk to the DJs. Listen, if you, I want you to set the mood right. Please play this music so people are in the right mood. So from the start, to introduce a genre like rap in a country like Cuba, where people like dancing so much, well, some people now are they are born rapping, but for those conditions to emerge, some people had to create a break in the frame of mind of people whose culture was based on popular dance music. I'm talking about the people, so to speak. So thanks to Alamar, because at a certain moment, and also thanks to the fact that many artists back then were extremely mature and they were able to take a genre that was created in the United States and which discussed the problems proper to the society in the United States, they were able to transpose it to Cuban society and to connect to their listening audience. And people felt very close to the artists because you dressed like them, you spoke their language, and when you went off the stage, you would sit down right next to them. There wasn't a distance. You was that kind of thing where artists are untouchable. No, people were part of the discourse. They were part of the songs and part of the emotions of the artist. So this was all created at a particular moment in time, and later institutions came to end it all, and they started to divide the festival. They divided a festival that gathered many people in the same theater into different activities on different days to fragment the scene. And since public transportation has always been so bad, somebody who lives in Marianao, it was very hard for them to go all the way to Alamar for an event because then it would take them hours to get back home. So institutions started to divide our activities and artists. You sell more, you belong to this, you don't belong to this, you're this and you're that. And so they started to create a range of divided fragments, and that weakened the movement. Even though the movement had appealed to artists from the international community like Tony Touch, Talib Kweli, and many people in the United States and Latin America, they would save for the whole years so they could come to the Cuban Rap Festival. It was a goal for them. So, Andri, I remember you describing uh, occasions when artists from the United States visited Cuba and interacted with you, and you discussed raciality. If I remember correctly, otherwise please correct me, a group that came from the United States, they were saying that they were deep racial issues in the United States, and you said that it was the same in Cuba and they did not agree. As I see it, race has been a problem in the island. When you think about the possibility for supporting a genre like hip hop or rap on TV, you find on TV, you will see salsa music or reggaeton, and also performers who, for the most part, are not black. And I remember discussing this with the two of you, especially when those artists visited. I can't remember who they were, but if you would like to tell us about that. One of the most important visits back then, and this is what eventually led the institutions to create the Cuban Rap Agency, was when Harry Belafonte visited Cuba. First, he met with a group of rappers, myself included, and then he personally met with Fidel Castro. And because of that, I think that I guess that maybe they told Abel Prieto, look, you need to do something about rap music because and so they created the Cuban Rap Agency, which, as I said, was designed to censor and divide. Many of those artists, I think that there was an exchange, there was feedback. Many of them saw us as exotic rappers in a country where they didn't know that they didn't expect to find rap. And they romanticized us because they perceived us as similar to the American rap performers in the early days. But there was a mutual feedback, as I said, because they started to teach us an understanding of a blackness that we didn't have here in Cuba. They introduced us to some lines of questioning, which we embraced. And at the same time, we had to explain to them, many of them, I think that they had an extremely romanticized vision of Cuban society, and we had to bring them down to earth and tell them how it really was. Let me interrupt you, Soandri. I have heard from people in the rap community and other Afro-descendant communities that I have worked with who tell me that there is a lot of discrimination in the island, and I would say that I agree. However, the Cuban government and its media say that there is no racial discrimination in Cuba. You told me that you had to explain to Harry Belafonte how there was racial discrimination in Cuban society. I wonder if you could do the same for us now so we can understand your point of view. Well, when we talked with Harry Belafonte, it was a very superficial conversation. It wasn't really a warm conversation because we were at the Center for the International Press, so it's not like when you're talking with someone walking around Alamar or waiting for a bus. But we explained to him the needs of artists, of hip hop creators, what they needed to be able to be a part of national culture in Cuba. Now, the fact that the government denies the existence of racism in Cuba, well, it's a form of censorship. It's a way of erasing a problem that exists. It's typically said by people who don't have the problem. They tell you about the problem, but they don't experience it. And to a certain extent, Cuban racism has its own identity. It is a very hypocritical form of racism. I think that Cuban propaganda or advertising is among the most racist in the world, and I have been in many places, and when I've seen There is advertising here that is horrifying. You can have an ad where they're looking for people to work at a restaurant, and it will say, you need to look well, you need to be white. You see things like this in Cuban television, and it has changed a little bit through the years. But I mean, one time I called Etelsa because in their catalog, I had to ask the person, are there any black people here? Because if you look at the catalog, it looked like a catalog from Germany. And the image that you have of a successful person in Cuba, it's white people. You only see white people enjoying tourism spots. And since childhood, from the stories that they read to you in school, Little Red Riding Hood and Goldilocks, you've also been taught that people who have success and money, that they do better the whiter they are, and eventually this is white privilege, and Cuba is no exception. The problem is that here the issue is censored. People cannot talk about it. Many people don't know. Many people think that being racist is tying somebody up and whipping them. They are not aware of, for example, passive violence, the fact that being a person of color, the system will retain you at the periphery, and it is harder for you to have access to institutions or universities, that because of the color of your skin, you don't you are more amenable to work in certain positions. You have to be in the kitchen in a hotel so people don't see you. So Cuba is an extremely racist country because it is completely normalized. And when you talk to people about racism in Cuba, it's like explaining water to a fish because we are immersed from birth in a structural racism that leaves no room for black people to explain their experience. People don't know what it is like to be a black person, to walk into a bus and people are checking their pockets. People move their purse or clutch their purse, and it's a negative propaganda that has been sustained year after year. In fact, in Cuba there is a whole range of racial mixtures and different skin colors, and it is used to distinguish those who are darker from those who are lighter. We have all of these categories, 70 different labels. And that classification, the purpose is to distinguish who's a bit lighter and who's a bit darker, and therefore who's a bit more reliable. Because social reliability in terms of employment is linked, directly linked to the hue of your skin. So you experience all of this in Cuba, but you cannot talk about it because the system tells you this is from the past. No, it's not from the past. It's present. We see it. And rap as a genre, do you think that how do you think that it has confronted racism? Well, when we matured with time, with study, looking for information, then we realized how much of a danger we were to Cuban culture because we were black people from a neighborhood who could summon people by speaking into a microphone. So when this image of success became public, and when it was clear that you didn't need to study music for 10 years to have an artistic project that gained some visibility, well, that set off the alarms. and they came up with that plan, which we were unaware of because they were extremely deceitful. They pretended to be helping us. Cuban Rap. Cuban Rap put on the table the discussion around independent people of color. We used a microphone and music to make these issues public, and we started to tell black people, you have worth. And we started to question the normalization of the way in which black people perceive themselves. Because black people are constantly being reminded of their past so that they feel, to some extent, complicit with the unfair, unjust reality that they are experiencing. Yes, they're supposed to be grateful to the revolution, right? Yeah, for sure. Of course, I am a person, I speak, I think, thanks to the revolution, quote unquote. That's what they say. But I will say this again. People are led to think, if there hadn't been a revolution, Cuba would not exist or the world would not exist. Where would we be? So, we learned a lot when we had these meetings with activists from the United States, and the government was aware because they have people everywhere. And they started to listen in. And those conversations, they've never been interested in that. Even a tourist, somebody from the neighborhood meets a tourist on the street, immediately the police person will come and say, you're harassing tourists and take you to prison. They want to keep tourists in a circuit uh, that people will come out saying that Cuba is so beautiful. And exactly the same thing happened in music. Sometimes you would say things without being aware of what you were saying, and somebody from outside with a different point of view, they would tell you, look, in this part of your song, is this what you meant? Because this and that. And that's when your mind would flip and you would understand the true meaning, because sometimes you were saying things without being aware of the magnitude of what you were saying. So when you compare with the way in which somebody who lives in a different reality, how they think, this allows you to find a different meaning in your work. And the government did not agree with that. They didn't like that. And this is why they opened the doors to reggaeton. And they really shoved reggaeton into people's minds to neutralize rap. Yes, certainly. Please allow me to make a leap. We were talking about the summit of the Americas in Panama, after which you, Soandry, were expelled from the rap agency, and you and others. But I remember that during that summit, Abel Pietro, who was not Minister of Culture at the time, he was an advisor to the president, who at the time was Raúl Castro. Abel, Abel Prieto said that there was going to be a cultural war in Panama. He said that that was the battlefield at the time. I remember what they did in Panama. They did some violent and rude things. The official delegation was extremely rude and violent. However, I'm interested in the nomenclature, in the terms that they use. The fact that they claimed to be engaged in a cultural war, I think the reason for that is because they realized that certain cultural forms had invaded Cuban society. One of them was Los Aldeano, maybe one of
pero
the
no eran los
most
únicos.
important
Habían muchos
groups
más
in
haciendo
Cuban rap.
una
They
canción de
were
protesta,
not
una
the
canción de
only
crítica
ones, of
social,
course, there
una
were many
canción
more
contestataria, como la entendíamos en aquel momento, ¿no?
doing critical
Entonces,
critical rap
mi
and
pregunta
protest
sería, y
rap.
Luiso, me encantaría que me comentaras, ¿cómo crees que
So my
influyó esta escena
question would
cultural,
be
esta,
for you,
esta
Luiso,
canción
could you
de
tell
crítica
us, do you
social o
think
esta
that this
canción pro
cultural
presidente
scene,
para la transformación del
this
pensamiento de la sociedad
these
cubana?
songs
Porque
that
hoy
were
escuchamos
dedicated to
una
social
famosa o
criticism,
muchas canciones de este
did
tipo
it change
y bueno, un
ways of
poco
thinking in
normal,
Cuban
porque puede ser muy buena
society?
la canción y la estamos oyendo y la
Nowadays, we
apreciamos, pero un
listen
poco
to
normal.
some of
Pero en
those
aquellos tiempos, una
songs, and
canción
well,
de
it might be a
naturaleza de
good
crítica social
song.
que además fuera completamente
It's normal, but
explícita,
back
ya no
then,
abstracta,
a
ya no
song like
poética, sino
that,
explícita, bueno, era un
which
salto
which used
de magnitud,
explicit
¿no? Era un salto
lyrics,
cualitativo
not
mucho mejor.
abstract or poetic
Entonces, me gustaría
metaphors,
si, como,
that was
si pudieses
a
narrarnos, reflejarnos tu
qualitative
visión, tu
leap.
experiencia, de la
It was
influencia que tuvo en
extremely
el rap de esta
significant back
época en que
then.
nosotros trabajábamos con
So, could
los más
you
grandes
please
exponentes de rap
tell us
cubano en
about how you
el
think at the
pensamiento
time
popular que hoy impera, el pensamiento crítico, el pensamiento de
how
distancia del
rap
gobierno cubano?
informed critical popular thought and this distancing from the Cuban government that now prevails in Cuban society? Well, as I recall in my experiences, if you examine the history of censorship in the revolution, you will find a bunch of artists from that time who were able to create work that was a bit more dissident than was the mainstream in Cuba. But what Los Aldeanos did, I don't think there anything similar had happened before. I don't think, it was a rap group that used a language that was almost punk, and it reached every corner of the island. They used this skill proper to hip hop to visibilize your social surroundings, and everyone started to listen to hip hop and develop a true political awareness of what was going on. I think that those were the seeds were planted back then by Los Aldeanos. Generations grew up listening to their music, and this is now part of their DNA, and that transformed the political context. And it is a factor in what we are experiencing today in the island. I think the contribution of rap, I don't think that we can overlook it. Without those political songs, and they were shattering, they were extremely powerful. Sometimes you would listen to one of those songs and you would look around because you thought something is about to happen. I remember when Los Aldeanos played in Rotilla Festival, it was almost 5 a.m. I had never been in a socially explosive space like that one. I thought the country could change that very night because there was such an energy. There were quite a few thousand people who waited until almost 5 a.m. to hear Los Aldeanos, and the feeling was so strong that I thought something's gonna happen, and of course something did happen, namely that alarms went off at the institutions and they extinguished the festival. They basically stole it. So for my generation, it was extremely important. We all grew up listening to this music, and that created the personalities, our way of being as human beings right now. And it was very important for Cuban activism. Hip hop has played a crucial role calling attention to social and political issues and cultural problems. And we were very attentive to this when we thought about how, what path the festival Puños Arriba could follow. I completely agree with the idea that Cuban hip hop and those critical songs completely altered the political context in the country. I'm convinced of it. When you talk about politics or activism nowadays, many people don't realize, but it was in fact hip hop that planted those seeds in Cuban culture, and they were the eye openers. Some of the songs, if you look some songs from way back, if you examine them now, and they are so conceptually valid, their perception of reality is so profound that they will never disappear. You might have, no matter how much reggaeton there is, those songs are still extremely significant and effective. And I don't think a government can control that because an authentic culture, a pure art form that reaches many people, they can't control that. I know that nowadays uh, Spanish language hip hop regards that age of Cuban hip hop as a crucial reference. Anywhere in Latin America or Europe, wherever Spanish is spoken, Cuban hip hop is recognized as a landmark. And hip hop did modify our way of speaking. It transformed it opened the eyes of many people who later grew up, and other artists came up, and now we are experiencing real activism in Cuba. And I think that the foundations were built by hip hop. I'm convinced of it. Yeah, 1 second, I want to add something to what Luisito just said. Before the era of YouTubers and bloggers, etc., etc., I said in a song that rap music was the musical press of the neighborhood. People got their news from hip hop, or else they used it to corroborate the information that they had. When rappers were talking about transportation, about love, about race, about their social surroundings and political issues. And although Cuban culture does not acknowledge it, they should thank rap, because the most famous performers now, reggaeton performers or whatever, they come from Cuban rap. And most of these famous performers, to some extent, they were influenced by Cuban rap as well. Cuban rap also nourished other genres. There are many examples of people who started out in rap, and I've said before that Cuban rap was an oasis. Many people stopped there to drink water and continued their path. And then they found where they were going, and they forgot that at some point along the way, that small oasis provided the necessary energy for them to reach their destination. Many people have forgotten this, but Cuban rap has contributed a lot to culture and changed the political vision of the country and the country's culture, and it has changed many people's lives. And I think that if we hadn't had the Cuban rap that emerged during the special period, the country would be a little bit worse. I think that in general, hip hop is a culture that was created here where I am now in New York, but it spread like gunpowder throughout the United States, and it reached every country of the planet. Nowadays, you will find it everywhere in all poor neighborhoods, especially you will find someone making hip hop, because the problems are always the same wherever you have a poor community. I think that it arrived in Cuba in a different way. It was a cultural import, but it became something authentic, something that we made our own, and we connected it to our own personal experiences. Many communities did the same. They assimilated hip hop, but we did it as best we knew, with humor, with charisma, something that is characteristic to Cuban society. And I agree. Without hip hop, Cuban culture would now be completely different. I'm convinced.
Miche, disculpa que te interrumpa, es que no te escucho.
Pido disculpas, había puesto el
Miche,
Bluetooth,
excuse me
Pido
for
disculpas
interrupting you.
respecto.
I can't hear
Lo
you.
estaba haciendo
Oh,
con
I
el Bluetooth.
apologize. I muted my microphone. So
Bueno, la
I'll
modifico.
repeat. I was
¿Cómo ves
asking a
el
question.
estatus del
I'm
rap
sorry.
cubano ahora mismo dentro de la isla
Okay,
de
I'll
Cuba?
change
¿Y
it.
hacia dónde te gustaría que fuese?
What do you think is the
Como
current
género, como
state
mercado,
of
¿hacia dónde
Cuban
te
rap in
gustaría
the island,
que se
and
desarrollase?
which direction do you wish that it would take?
Realmente hace un par de años
How would you
estoy,
like it to
estoy en
develop?
Nueva York, no tengo la cercanía que tenía
Well,
cuando estábamos trabajando en Puño
I
Arriba, sí
have been
teníamos un
living in New
contacto
York for a
muy
couple of
cercano con
years, so
esa
I am not
producción
as close
discográfica
as I was when we
que
were
se producía
working in
recientemente.
Puños
Bueno, por
Arriba.
envidia
We
eso
were
llegaba a nuestras manos,
very
ese
close to the
acceso ahora
music
mismo no
that
lo
was
tengo,
being produced.
pero sí estoy
People
informado
would
de
record
que se
music and
produce
we would have it
muchísima
a
música
couple
en
of
Cuba
days later,
todavía,
and that's no longer the case.
muchísimos estudios
But
independientes que
I
siguen,
know
que
that
siguen trabajando, siguen
people are producing a
generando
lot of interesting
muchísima
music. There are
obra
many
y
independent
muchísima calidad.
studios,
Eh, Nada, realmente
and they're
a mí me
putting out
gustaría que el hip hop
very good
cubano
work.
mantuviera la misma dirección, ese contacto ahí con la
I would
realidad,
like Cuban
pero que
hip
también
hop
tuviera acceso desde esa
to maintain
autonomía, desde
its
esa
path, that remain in
sinceridad que
touch with
siempre lo ha
reality,
caracterizado sin
but
perder
I would
ese
also
objetivo,
like
que
to have
tuviera también
access
acceso a un
to
mercado, porque realmente el mercado
autonomy and
ayuda a
honesty,
desarrollar, da
but
las
also
herramientas,
a
da los
market,
recursos
because
necesarios
the
para que todos
market
los artistas y
really
que todos
provides the tools,
los
the
actores
necessary
de esta
resources
cultura
for
puedan seguirse
artists
desarrollando y puedan seguir creciendo, ¿me entiendes?
and the people who
Entonces, nada, a mí
participate in this
realmente
culture
me
to
gustaría
develop and
que en
continue to
Cuba se
grow.
siguiera produciendo, se siguiera
So I would
produciendo
really
rap. Me
like
gustaría que los artistas cubanos que no residen ahora mismo dentro de la isla tuvieran
I
más
would like
contacto
Cuban
con los artistas que
artists
estuvieran
who
dentro
are
de la
not
isla, que
living
tuviéramos una
in the
especie
island to be
de
remain in
conexión
touch
ahí,
with
¿no? Sin
artists
perder
inside the
calidad,
island. I
un
wish that
acceso
we
a
had a
música
kind
de
of
calidad independiente,
convention,
pero sería algo así como
each one
que
dealing with their
favorezca
own reality,
muchísimo
of
al
course.
movimiento, ¿no? A la cultura en general.
But
Yo lo
I
me
think that
refiero
that
además
would
a cultura,
be
no movimiento,
very good for the
a
movement
la
and the
cultura en general
culture.
y que
I
nada,
like
que
to
se
call it a
siguiera
culture
produciendo
rather than
música,
a
porque al final
movement. So
esta
to the
música
hip
es
hop
una
culture
cultura
in general,
basada básicamente en
I
la
hope
música y
that
mantener
we
los
continue
valores
to
nacionales
produce
allí,
music
musicales y
because
tal, que pueden
it's a musical art form
determinar un poco
basically, and we have
la estética, ¿no? Del hip hop
a
nacional, que todo eso es
national
simpático realmente.
¿Te gustaría volver a trabajar
aesthetic, a
con
national hip
los
hop.
raperos, con el género? En
Would you
Cuba así
like
fue.
to work
Me
again
encantaría,
with
me encantaría. Realmente
rappers in
yo,
Cuba or elsewhere?
desde mi experiencia,
Yes, I would love
estoy aquí
to.
en Brooklyn ahora, brother, y es increíble caminar por las calles aquí. Aquí es
I,
donde
I live in
este
Brooklyn
movimiento
now,
se
and
inventó realmente. Y
it's
una vez que tú estás
amazing when
aquí, tú
you
ves
walk
cómo
down the
funciona
streets.
todo, cómo
This
se
is where
construye
hip
la
hop
gente,
was
cómo
born.
los viejitos
And
en
when
las
you're
esquinas con la
here,
gorra para
you
atrás
see
empiezan a
how it
buscar
all works,
rapero.
how people
Cuando tú ves eso,
behave.
tú realmente entiendes de
Old
dónde
man
salió esa
on the
cultura, ¿no? Y cómo
corner.
nosotros lo importamos. Pero
When you see
nosotros lo
that, you
importamos,
understand
lo
where the
asociamos de
culture
manera
comes
diferente.
from
Con
and
gente como
how we
Soandry, con
imported
gente
it.
como los Aldeanos,
But
con gente
we
como
we
grupos como Anónimo
gave it a
Consejo,
different
que de alguna
direction. People
manera
like Soandri and Los
implementan una
Aldeanos,
estética completamente
Anónimo
nueva y
Consejo, these
actualizaron esa
artists
visión, esa
somehow
manera de ver
created a unique
del
aesthetic
rap cubano, del
and
rap
they
boricua, del rap
updated that
dominicano en general.
vision.
Y sí, ojalá tuviéramos la oportunidad nuevo de poder desarrollar algo que
So
ayudara
yes, I
un
really
poco
wish that I had
a
again the
visibilizar una
opportunity
vez más este
to
movimiento tan
develop
valioso a
something
Cuba, ¿me
that
entiendes?
could
Sí,
help us to make
sí.
this movement visible
Muchísimas
again.
gracias, Luiso. Tenía esta misma pregunta para Soandri, pero bueno, parece que se ha caído.
Thank you,
Quería hacer una
Luiso. I
pregunta
wanted
sobre
to
esto.
ask
Soandri está
Soandri
en
the same
Cuba,
question,
en
but
La
it seems
Habana, en
that he lost
Cocina,
his connection.
específicamente allí las
I want
conexiones
to
son
make an
muy
observation.
complicadas,
He is
pero también
in
es muy
Cuba,
complicado
La Habana,
compartir la
Cojima,
seguridad personal
and
cuando
internet
él o ha
connection is
sido
very
guionista
complicated
periodístico que
there.
ha levantado su voz
And
para
also,
denunciar, bueno, los
when you are a
desmanes
critical
cometidos por el
artist,
sistema.
when
Pongo
you
como
have
paréntesis en alguna ocasión
denounced the
previo a
abuses
la
of the
realización
Cuban
de uno de estos
system, then
festivales en Puños
sometimes
Arriba,
your
Soandri
safety
y
is at
yo
risk.
fuimos amenazados de muerte por un
For
oficial de la
example,
seguridad del
before
Estado. Fue
one
un
of
poco
the
abrupto, pero nos dijo aquí
occasions
cualquiera
of
tiene un
the
accidente, aquí a
festival,
cualquiera le cae un
an agent from state security threatened us to death. He told us anyone can have an accident, anyone can be hit by lightning. So he was warning us that we shouldn't go too far when we. And so I make this observation because Soandry is still in Cuba. He lost his connection, and I'm guessing he won't be back. I thank INSTAR and everyone who has made this event possible. I thank Luiso and Soandry. Thank you for inviting us. And we'll stay in touch. Thank you. I hope to see you soon.